What's up, everybody? Jakar here again. So I'm guessing if you're watching this, you probably saw what I posted on my Snapchat and my Instagram. This is going to be an extended book review, and again, it's about making Hispanics, how activists, bureaucrats, and the media constructed a new American. Again, it's by G. Mora. G. Christina Mora. She's an associate professor at UC Berkeley. And again, this book was published in 2014. So again, I didn't really have time to explain it in the minute-long video that I posted, but this book is very information heavy, and honestly, the book itself isn't that long. It is, let's see, the book itself is 169 pages, so it's not that long of a read, but it's very, very heavy, thorough information. And even if you go to the back of the book and start looking through her citations about where she got her information and everything from, honestly, in all, she probably used anywhere from 200 to 300 different sources that she cites in her book, and honestly, there's probably more. I just obviously didn't have time to count them all. So, yeah, this book, really great book, super informational, and all this book has, this information is talking about how Hispanic became the word to, it was the pan-ethnic word that would describe the Latinx community, and basically the progression through that. And she gives great history, great knowledge, and talking about the different facets of the Latinx community that come into play during this time period. And so, I think, whenever you have a chance to look at different research or different information about a certain subject or topic matter, you should definitely try to go out and read it. With hers, though, I really do think that this is something that's very foundational when we're talking about this time period, and specifically about this topic of how did we get to Hispanic and how did we get to the point of using this word. So I would really, I'm very big on this book after I read it. Not to say that I will read other things that have to do specifically with the Latinx community, but this is probably going to become one of the main sources of information for me that I have gotten. Going to Central Washington University in Ellensburg, Washington, I've gotten to know more about the Latinx community, more than I have learned before. And real quick shout out to all the 2019 graduates from Central Washington University. We made it. But over on this side of the state, going east of the mountains, I've had a chance to really be able to interact with that community and be around that community and learn directly from them, also while doing my own personal education, and then also taking a couple classes that have to do with Latinx, the Latinx community specifically, and also the history that goes behind it. And there's an endless amount of knowledge that you can gain, especially about the history, that will tell you where we're at in our country with certain things that deal with the Latinx community. And this is one of those books that I think does a very good job of it. And so I don't have, if I decide to go through all the information that I learned in this book, even through all the notes that I took, and stuff that I cited, page numbers and things that I wanted to go over, it would take too long. I'm not going to do that, but I'm going to try to hit on some of the main points so this video isn't too long. And then if any of y'all have any other questions, just let me know. I actually purchased this book off Amazon. I was looking through some other books, and it came up on my suggestions list. And I got it from a third party. So if you have any questions, about where to get it, I would say Amazon, but you might have to go other places just depending on whether they have it in stock or not. Again, the book came out in 2014, so it's been out for about 5 years now. But again, I think the information here is still very relevant. And when we talk about books that have historical significance, they'll always be relevant because that is information that's not going to change. There always can be newly discovered information about it, of course, but a lot of information in here is stuff that has already happened, and she's kind of solidified it. So in a lot of ways, this book is kind of timeless and never will lose its value. Whatever, if the next generation reads this, if somebody who's in my generation reads it, it's going to still have the same content. It's going to be pertinent to show people the roots of where the idea of the word Hispanic came from, and the whole ideology about making that a pan-ethnic identity for the entire Latinx community. So what she first talks about in the beginning of the book is she just touches on like what makes Hispanics Hispanic, and I think that's very important because when people think of Hispanic, they're just thinking of this overarching term that describes all Latinx people, which is true. But again, why did we get there, and what's the main reason? What's the because of that. And so the big thinking for this is when we look at Latinx people or Latinx community in the United States, there's a lot of people who come from Mexico. So one of the things I guess I should lay out first is that the main three groups she talks about that kind of dominate the idea of talking about getting representation, because that's one of the big things, especially for activists, that they were trying to do, is Mexican Americans, Cuban Americans, and Puerto Ricans. And as you know, Puerto Rico is a territory, so everybody who's in that territory is considered a United States citizen, but they're not treated like a United States citizen. And then also looking at Mexican Americans and Cuban Americans, they have different issues that they're trying to push on their agenda. So for Mexican Americans, they're talking more about things that have to do with workers' rights or immigration from the South coming to the North. And then you look at Cuban Americans, who the Reagan administration allows to come from Cuba and kind of basically allow America to be a safe haven for them. You see them more worried about the foreign policy relations with Cuba. And then Puerto Ricans are dealing more on the East Coast, because that's where they're mostly concentrated, kind of in that New York and a little farther down the East Coast area. They're more focused on the relations back home with Puerto Rico, and them, because they're already U.S. citizens, they're dealing with more things where they need to try to figure out, like, our personal, how are we going to be able to be on a level playing field in the United States, even though we're considered United States citizens? How do we allow ourselves to take advantage of that and have the same opportunities as other people in the United States? And obviously, as you know, predominantly white society in the U.S. at the time. If you're a white male, that's the top of the food chain for you. So the thing is that trying to combine all these different cultures, traditions within the Latinx community is very hard. So there are activists, throughout this book where G. Christina Moore talks about how they actually kind of go back and forth about, like, well, we're not really interested in pushing this because it doesn't affect us directly, or we want to push this because it does affect us directly. And then you have these factions that are within the Latinx community itself. So it's very important, because when the government's trying to eventually push them all in together, activists are kind of in some ways fighting against each other, because like, we can't do this. We can't give up what our identity is within the Latinx community itself, with where we come from, but at the same time they're like, well, we will not get representation any other way. So part of that also comes into play because in the 60s, civil rights was going on, and John F. Kennedy was the person who really pushed that. Then he gets assassinated, and then Lyndon B. Johnson in 64 and 65 signs legislation that actually does enact civil rights. Now, what's very interesting in this book is, and I don't know it off the top of my head, but when she goes into the part about Lyndon B. Johnson, after he signs civil rights for the black community, he basically neglects the Latinx community, because he feels like, I've done this for the black community, but I'm not going to do it for you. So Latinx community is still fighting a very, very uphill battle. And one of the biggest things that is a connector in this entire book with the media, activists, and bureaucrats is the census. Because for a long time, and I don't think people know this, Latinx people, and obviously, within each community, as in the black community, there's colorism, but Latinx people were actually counted as white on the census. And so building up to the 1970 census, there was a big push to try to get people counted as Latinx, because what the Latinx community is saying is, we don't have these same advantages that the white community does. So why are you counting us as white? So one big pillar that connects, or that the United States government thinks connects all of the Latinx community, is their language. They're like, well, they all speak Spanish, so that must be where one of the big connections is. So why don't we play off that? Now, as you know, there are a lot of countries in Latin America, and obviously people in Mexico speak Spanish, and then if you go farther down in South America, but that doesn't mean that everybody is necessarily. First of all, it doesn't mean that everybody's speaking Spanish, and that doesn't mean that they're necessarily speaking a similar dialect, because you go farther into linguistics, it's like, that's just not how it works. So anyway, they use this. So one of the first categories where they try to count the Latinx community is Spanish speaking, and it's very interesting how this progression goes about, because people are like, oh, this is it, this is perfect, we can get them all to go together in one group. And again, the Latinx community is pushing back, and this pushback kind of comes all together. So as Mora goes along, she talks about this. She talks about how like they're coming together. And there's really an idea of like, how do we define Hispanic pan-ethnicity? So it's very interesting is that the media plays a very big role in this, because the Latinx media we see now in the United States, their roots actually start really in this era. So there are these programs that are coming from outside the country, and then they start inside the country of the United States, and they're doing all these things. But what they do is they start to uniformly across the board change how people are speaking Spanish. So if there's like more formal Spanish, that's what they want on the airwaves, whether it's the radio or television, and then they cut out the slang Spanish, or certain Spanish words that within, for example, there might be a Spanish word with Puerto Ricans that's not acceptable with Mexicans. And so there starts to become this, like I said, this uniformly changed language that they're trying to set all the way across the board, which is very interesting, because then the media starts to play this to their advantage, and they're trying to just capture as much of the Latinx community as they can. So now not only do they have to make a uniform language all the way across that's acceptable so they don't offend certain Latinx communities, but they're also trying to capture all of the Latinx community, the different factions that are within the community, by Mexican soap operas, different shows through the radio, through television eventually. And they're trying to play to each demographic that's within the Latinx community itself. So they want something for Puerto Ricans, they want something for Mexicans, they want something for Cubans, and so on and so forth. So it becomes a very interesting kind of like back and forth, and almost like a trial and error type of piece. And again, all these media companies are playing on the fact that they're using Hispanic. Like, they put Hispanic at the forefront and start advertising it. So the traditional train of thought is that the United States government is the one who pushed the Hispanic identity. And they did. That's very true. But there are prominent Latinx leaders who are in the government, and also activists who decide, well, you know what? We need to do this, because if we want any type of representation and we want to be counted separate from white people on the census, we have to take this on. Now, of course, like I said, especially activists are not happy. There are a lot of activists who don't agree with this. They're like, this is a terrible idea. It's literally putting us all into one group and saying we're the same. And again, anybody who's educated would know that this is not true. But again, it's a battle over, do we give up the chance to have representation, or do we try to go and take what we can get right now? Because if we don't, we're still going to be at a disadvantage, and there will be no money given to us or our communities. And so that's a big thing with the census too. In this time period, trying to get on the census and represented properly is big, because one, federal funding are going to go to those communities based on the numbers that come in. And the second part is that if they're not properly identified on the census, or the proper questions aren't asked in the right way, then the Latinx community will first of all not fill out the census, or even if there are questions about being part of the Latinx community, they won't answer them at all, because they don't know what's right or not. So it becomes this huge trial and error, and all these groups kind of merge together. And like I said, there are a lot of people within the Latinx community that disagree, but again, this starts to get pushed forward. And so we start to see this with the Nixon administration. He plays on this a lot, where he's trying to get the Latinx to vote. And as other presidents come down the line, they do the same thing. But it's very interesting, because one of the things, and honestly, I don't have enough time to tell you all the organizations, but there are so many different organizations that are created at this time to talk about these issues of Latinx, like the status of the Latinx community in the United States, what needs to be done, where does help need to be given, and how do we go about doing this. And so you have groups like, you have groups like the IMAA, which is Interagency on Mexican American Affairs. You have the CCOSSP, Cabinet Committee on Opportunities for Spanish-Speaking People. You have the FNHO, Forum of National Hispanic Organizations. HACER, Hispanic Association for Corporate Responsibility. There are just so many, and all these different organizations are being made because they do represent certain things, certain subject and topic matters within the Latinx community. So sometimes it's business, sometimes it's politics, sometimes it's talking about the bare minimums of what you need in specific Latinx communities. And the other thing that you have to, be aware of is that within the Latinx community itself, there was always an argument about, do we have enough representation from the different Latinx communities, because there was always a worry that it was too Mexican-centric, and if this was the case, there wouldn't be fair representation given to all the demographics of Latinx people that lived in the United States. And again, those three major groups are Mexican Americans, Cuban Americans, and Puerto Ricans. Those are the three main ones. But then we look at everybody that's coming from Central America and all the people who are coming from South America. And so trying to also find a place for them in all of this too, so they don't feel like they're being isolated. And so it's a really interesting relationship between pan-ethnicity and nationality, and also keeping the tradition and culture for every single group, but also having a way for them all to feel included. And so again, once the idea of Hispanic comes up, the United States government's like, we like this. And then you have the activists who want it, and also people who are within, who are Latinx, who are in the government as elected representatives, and also people in the media. They're like, oh yeah, like we were all on board for this, so they start to push it. Once it kind of gets the approval from all those groups, your bureaucrats, the activists who are on board with it, and then also the media then takes it and pushes it out even more and puts it into the mainstream. And so then really from there, I mean, it's very cliche, but the rest is history. This idea, this word of Hispanic is what's used by most Americans when they're looking at the Latinx community. I mean, even people within the Latinx community use this term Hispanic now and identify that way. I would just say that, obviously for me, I'm not part of the Latinx community. I'm Indian, black, and white. And so when I was growing up also, I thought Hispanic was the word, but then as I got older and got more educated, Latinx is actually a better representation. And in this book, Mora also talks about that, about the fight back and forth between why can't we use Latino, why can't we use that to describe all of us, and there's a bigger issue with it. And it's funny now because more people who are claimed to be Hispanic or Latinx, they actually want the Latinx term brought back instead of Hispanic, and we still see Hispanic used on the census and other forms and other documentation when we're talking about if somebody is of Latinx origin. Hispanic is the word that's still used today. It'll be very interesting to see that maybe in the future if that changes, especially if the Latinx community thinks that's a better representation than Hispanic, because again, Hispanic isn't this term that traditionally comes from anywhere. It's a made-up term, and it's a lot of it was the U.S. government again, but these the media and activists who wanted to consolidate power and have representation, this is where that word comes from. They settled on this. So I think the other thing is that she really goes into depth, and as you keep reading, one of the things I will read to you is she left me was one of her last pages. It was very interesting because the thing is that she goes through all these ideas and how we came to use Hispanic on these documents and stuff. But at the end of the day, she says this. It was very interesting. I agree with it. In conclusion, it is important to consider what the history related in this book means for identity politics. That my study reveals the web of interest and organizations that help to institutionalize the Hispanic category over time does not necessarily mean that pan-ethnicity is somehow untrue or false. All identities are social constructs, and none are completely accepted by every member of a given group. Nation-states had to forge national identities at one point, just as ethnic and racial group leaders have had to do for ethnicity and race, respectively. There are no true or false identities, for each is the product of a socio-historical process. And so this is like the last page of the book. So there's a lot of stuff that stuck with me in this book. It's just very information heavy, so I couldn't go through all of it because I have like 2 or 3 pages that I've cited at a time that have to deal with the subject matter or something. But that last part is so true. So again, I do think that for me, what I also have learned from people who I know in the Latinx community, I think Latinx is the proper term to be able, the proper term that needs to be used, and that's what I've been told. So I try to use that instead of Hispanic. But again, this is a conversation that doesn't really have it's right or wrong. Like, people will try to say it, but as I think most things are in our world, things are complex, and there's a multitude of facets that are within this topic, especially when we talk about the identity of the Latinx community, whether that's Latinx, Hispanic, and then diving into the nationality of where all these people within the Latinx community come from. So that just becomes a huge web conversation. But again, this read is very interesting. It tells you how we got to the word Hispanic, and I think a lot of things she points out is why we got there and why that could be problematic. And so maybe we do, I think, need to consider a different word to be able to use instead of Hispanic. And from, like I said, from what I've learned from people I've talked to, Latinx is better, but there are also a lot of people within the Latinx community who identify as Hispanic. So it's this very, very interesting relationship. And like I said, it's very complex, and it will definitely need to be talked about more. But that's what I got for this book. Like I said, it's a lot of content. If you have any more questions specifically about it, I can look back at the notes. I could let you know. I will be doing a book review sooner, not waiting as long as I did. Got busy with school and stuff, but I've graduated now, so I'll be doing stuff when I head back home. So again, I hope you enjoy this book review. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments, and I'll get a notification, and I'll check them. Thank you all for watching, and again, until next time, please go out, read some books, read this book. If you have any other kind of book suggestions you would look for or looking for, just feel free to message me or contact me somehow. So thank you all for watching.